ChatGerry, Theory of Plates and Shells with Heart or Brain, number 1550, VPT 103, February 25, 2026, Gerald C. EclaireMD Foundation, Category, Methodology Engineering and Heart or Brain. From Plates and Shells to the Beating Heart. When I look back at my training at MIT under Professor Norman Jones in the early 1970s and compare it with my current work in chronic disease and stroke I no longer see the different disciplines. I see the same physical system expressed through different materials, different geometries, and different scales. In those years I studied how plates and shell structures behaved under repeated dynamic loading. A flat plate resisted force through bending and in plane stress, while a curved shell carried load more efficiently through membrane action. The central question was never the single impact. The real issue was how much total energy entered the structure, how much could be dissipated, how the internal condition changed over time, and how the safety margin gradually declined. Heat generation during cyclic loading was not just a thermal phenomenon. It was the visible signature that mechanical energy had been absorbed and that fatigue was taking place. When the rate of heat generation exceeded the structure's ability to dissipate it, local softening and failure followed. Mechanical behavior and thermal behavior were two aspects of the same energy process. This energy-based understanding stayed in my mind for decades. From structural steel to living tissue between 1984 and 2004, I survived 5 cardiac episodes, when I later began to examine my own cardiovascular system through long-term quantitative data. I suddenly recognized the same structural logic that I had studied in steel and concrete. The left ventricle is neither a pure plate nor a pure shell, yet it contains the characteristics of both. Its wall has thickness like a plate, but its curved geometry allows it to function as a pressure vessel. With every heartbeat it shortens, thickens, bends, and relaxes under repeated internal loading from blood pressure. The myocardial tissue absorbs, stores, and dissipates energy in each cycle. In engineering, curvature allows a shell to distribute load efficiently. In the heart, ventricular curvature converts internal pressure into wall tension in an optimal way. However, when long-term metabolic disorder, fibrosis, or hypertrophy changes the material properties of the wall, the same pressure produces higher stress because the structure has lost elasticity and reserve. This is directly comparable to a fatigue plate or shell. The load may be unchanged, but the internal condition is no longer the same. Metabolism plays the role that heat played in structural mechanics. Part of biochemical energy becomes mechanical work and part is dissipated. In a healthy system, this energy flow is efficient. In a metabolically disordered state, more energy is lost, and the tissue gradually changes its properties. What clinicians call ventricular remodeling is, from an engineering viewpoint, structural adaptation to long-term loading. Why single measurements cannot reveal structural reality. This is why two individuals with similar blood pressure readings can have completely different cardiac outcomes. In structural mechanics, two components subjected to the same peak force may survive or fail depending on their geometry, material condition, and cumulative energy history. The same principle applies to the heart and brain. The decisive factor is not the single measurement but the remaining structural reserve. For this reason, I do not interpret chronic disease through isolated laboratory values. A single number is equivalent to measuring the load on a plate at one instant. It cannot reveal fatigue, energy accumulation, or remaining life. Only a continuous record can show how the structure has evolved. In one of my recent studies comparing my stroke risk with my wife's, her TSI was higher than mine, yet her vascular structure was stronger, while I experienced the stroke. This is pure structural mechanics. Load alone does not determine failure. Structural condition determines outcome. Repeated load, energy accumulation, and final failure. A plate clamped at its edges and struck repeatedly does not fail from one impact. Each loading cycle adds a small amount of internal damage. If the material is healthy, it dissipates energy and returns close to its original state. If it is fatigued, the same force produces larger deformation and less recovery until failure occurs. The heart behaves in exactly the same way. Each heartbeat is a loading cycle. Chronic hypertension increases the load. Diabetes and inflammation alter the material. Fibrosis makes the wall stiff and less able to relax. The system consumes more energy for the same output and gradually loses reserve. A bridge does not collapse because of one heavy truck. It collapses after years of accumulated loading that slowly reduces its safety margin. Likewise, a cerebral vessel does not rupture because of one high glucose reading. On June 21, 2025. An acute surge in blood pressure ruptured a calcified microvessel in my brain because the structural reserve had already been reduced by decades of metabolic damage. Why soil is actually a very good analogy. Soil mechanics is based on nonlinear response path dependence consolidation over time creep under sustained load irreversible deformation. Structure changing with loading history water energy dissipation effects. Now, let us compare that to arteries, myocardium, and brain microvessels. They stiffen over time, remodel under chronic pressure, accumulate damage, partially repair. Behave differently depending on loading history, have rate-dependent responsiveness is much closer to soil behavior than to ideal elastic steel. Path-dependent living structures. What I understand clearly today is that biological tissue behaves more like soil than like ideal elastic steel. Its response is time-dependent and path-dependent. It remodels, partially repairs, stiffens, and accumulates irreversible change. This is why two people with the same blood pressure today can have completely different outcomes. Their loading histories are different. This continuous intellectual line from blast-resistant structural design to chronic disease analysis explains why my research begins with load, energy, geometry, and time rather than statistical correlation. In the early years, the structure was made of steel and the validation came from desert blast experiments. Today, the structure is made of living cells and the validation comes from 17 years of continuous physiological data. The domain has changed, but the governing physics has not. Conclusion: this is the direct connection between what I learned at MIT in 1970 to plus what Jay learned at UC Berkeley in 1979, and what I am doing in biomedical research more than 5 decades later. In addition, my work in artificial intelligence has always focused on theory and system structure rather than software tools. Because understanding the governing mechanism is the only way to control a real system over time. Through persistent self-study of medicine and lifestyle intervention, I have extended my biological life from 65 to 79 and survived 9 major mortality challenges. My engineering studies served my professional career, but my medical studies served my survival and longevity. Disclaimer: I write this paper not for fame, but to share what I have learned so others can understand their health, prevent disease, and live longer, healthier lives. This content is provided for educational reference only and does not constitute medical advice. No doctor-patient relationship is created. You may share this summary freely, but it must not be altered, edited, or republished as your own. All intellectual property rights and copyrights for this article and its related materials belong to the author, Gerald C. This content is provided for educational reference only and does not constitute medical advice. No doctor-patient relationship is created. You may share this summary freely, but it must not be altered, edited, or republished as your own. All intellectual property rights and copyrights for this article and its related materials belong to the author, Gerald C.